70-year-old Opal was fading, her poetry confined to forgotten receipts in a desert trailer. 21-year-old Ezra was lost, his future crumbling. Their lives, seemingly destined for obscurity, collided when a single, profound poem, found on a grocery store bulletin board, offered a lifeline to both. Opal, at 70, measured her days not in hours, but in the slow, syrupy creep of pain. Once, she had been a poet, her words finding homes in slim, respected journals that now gathered dust in a cardboard box under her bed. But life, with its relentless pragmatism, had a way of grinding down brilliance into a fine, forgotten powder. Now, her world was the cramped interior of a tin can trailer in Kestrel's Rest, a park perched on the blistered edge of the Arizona desert. She was alone, and late-stage liver disease was a quiet, methodical thief stealing what little future she had left. But one ritual remained, a final, defiant flicker against the encroaching dark. Every morning, before the sun baked the world into submission, she would retrieve a discarded cash register receipt from a chipped teacup. With a cheap ballpoint pen held in a trembling hand, she would compose a short poem on its blank side. It was her sole act of rebellion against the pain, the suffocating loneliness, and the quiet erasure of her existence. The poem written, she would lean heavily on a worn wooden cane and begin the slow, arduous pilgrimage to the Dune Mart, the town's only grocery store. She'd push through the glass doors, ignoring the pitying glances from the staff who knew her story, and make her way to the cluttered community bulletin board. There, amidst a chaotic collage of a small town's life, lost dog flyers, ads for second-hand cribs, a plea for a rideshare to Phoenix, she would find a small, overlooked space. With a rusted thumbtack, she'd pin her daily offering. It wasn't for an audience, not really. It was a message in a bottle, tossed not into an ocean, but into the indifferent currents of daily errands. It was her final, faint proof that Opal, the poet, was still here. Ezra, at 21, was adrift in a sea of his own wreckage. He was an English literature major, or at least he had been until 2 weeks ago. He loved the weight of old books, the way a single line of poetry could hold more truth than a history textbook. His grandmother, Eleanor, had nurtured that love. Her voice, reading Yeats by the fireside, was the soundtrack of his childhood. But Eleanor was gone, taken by a swift and merciless pneumonia 6 months prior, and with her, the anchor of his world had been pulled. Then came the second blow, a sterile, formal letter from his prestigious East Coast university. Funding cuts, scholarship terminated. The tuition was an impossible mountain, and the identity he had been so carefully building, Ezra, the scholar, crumbled into dust. So he packed his entire life into his sputtering 2004 Honda Civic, a high school graduation gift from Eleanor that now felt like the last relic of a forgotten civilization. He was driving west, a reluctant pilgrim heading toward the vague promise of a cousin's couch in California. The journey was a blur of monotonous asphalt and regret, the Arizona landscape repeating itself into a hypnotic, desolate pattern. He drove in silence, unable to bear the manufactured cheerfulness of the radio. The quiet was heavy, filled with the gnawing anxiety that he was moving in the wrong direction, not just geographically, but in the entire trajectory of his life. One sweltering afternoon, as the sun beat down on the cracked dashboard, the Honda gave a shuddering metallic cough, and the temperature gauge shot into the red. He pulled off the highway, coasting into the dusty parking lot of the Dune Mart with a sense of grim finality. All he wanted was a bottle of cold water, a moment of respite from the oppressive heat and the even more oppressive weight of his failure. As he walked toward the entrance, his eyes, weary and unfocused, grazed over the community bulletin board. He was just killing time, a commodity he suddenly had too much of. He wasn't looking for anything, but in the chaotic tapestry of local life, a single, stark piece of paper snagged his attention. It was a faded receipt, out of place and fragile, yet it held a quiet gravity that made him stop. He leaned in closer. The paper was a receipt from the Dune Mart itself, dated the day before. On its back, written in a fine, elegant script that seemed to defy the unsteadiness of the hand that wrote it, was a poem. The ink was a faded blue, the letters precise yet imbued with a subtle tremor. The title was simple, Cicada Song for August. Ezra read it once, then again. It wasn't a poem of intricate metaphors or academic cleverness. It was something far more raw and profound. It spoke of the desert heat, not as an enemy, but as a final, clarifying furnace. It described the drone of a cicada not as a sound, but as the earth's own desperate, beautiful prayer, a creature singing its heart out in the last moments of its short life, knowing that silence was coming. The final line spoke of a soul worn thin as a window pane, yet still turning its face to the sky, to be shattered by the last light. The words bypassed his brain and struck a chord deep in his chest. In that simple, devastating verse, he felt the echo of his own grief. He saw his grandmother, Alina, in her final days, her body frail but her spirit stubbornly tending to the wilting geraniums on her windowsill. He felt the poem's immense, uncomplaining loneliness, its quiet dignity in the face of absolute erasure. It was a perfect, crystalline expression of the courage it takes to simply exist when the world is telling you to fade away. A hot, thick lump formed in his throat. To his own astonishment, tears began to well in his eyes, blurring the dusty parking lot into a watercolor of shimmering heat. Here, in the most unlikely of places, a stranger's words on a piece of trash had reached into the mess of his own sorrow and offered a moment of sublime, heartbreaking understanding. He felt seen. A 21-year-old man, 1,000 miles from anything he could call home, stood crying in front of a grocery store bulletin board. With a reverence he couldn't explain, he carefully worked the thumbtack free and slipped the receipt into his shirt pocket, right over his heart. It felt less like paper and more like a sacred artifact. He had to find who wrote this. He had to. Ezra pushed through the automatic doors, the blast of air conditioning a shock to his system. He blinked, his eyes adjusting from the harsh sunlight. He saw a young man, probably his own age, wearing a red Dune Mart apron and methodically stocking cans of green beans. Ezra approached him, the precious receipt held carefully in his hand. "Excuse me," Ezra began, his voice still a little thick. "I found this on the board outside, this poem. Do you have any idea who might have written it?" The stalker, whose name tag read Kyle, glanced at the receipt. A look of weary recognition crossed his face. "Oh, that's Opal's," he said, turning back to his cans. "Yeah, she's in here almost every day, pins one of those up." Opal, Ezra's heart leaped. "A name? Does she live around here?" Kyle gestured vaguely with a can of beans. "Kestrel's Rest. The trailer parked down the road. She's kind of a fixture, I guess. A bit of a strange old bird." The casual dismissal in his tone grated on Ezra. Strange old bird. The person who wrote that poem was a universe. Thanking the clerk, Ezra hurried back to his car. Kestrel's Rest was easy to find, a collection of aging trailers shimmering under the relentless sun. It was a place of quiet desperation, of cracked vinyl siding and sun-bleached plastic flamingos. He drove slowly down the narrow, dusty lane, looking for a sign, any sign. He decided to trust the poem. The person who wrote it, he reasoned, would care for their small corner of the world, no matter how humble. He passed trailers with overgrown weeds and cluttered porches until he saw it. A vintage Airstream, older and more weathered than the rest, but its small patch of dirt was swept clean. A single, resilient desert marigold bloomed in a terracotta pot by the door, and the small window, though streaked with age, was undeniably clean. This had to be it. He parked his car and walked to the door, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He felt like an intruder, a trespasser on a private grief. He raised his hand and knocked, the sound echoing unnervingly in the afternoon stillness. After a long moment, the door creaked open a few inches, and a pair of wary, pale blue eyes peered out at him from a deeply lined face. He saw a woman, impossibly frail, her skin thin as parchment, her body stooped with an exhaustion that went far beyond age. It was Opal. Can I help you? Her voice was a dry rasp, laced with suspicion. She clutched a threadbare cardigan around her thin shoulders, the aluminum door a shield between her and this unexpected intrusion. Ezra's carefully rehearsed words abandoned him. He felt clumsy, foolish. I'm sorry to bother you, he stammered, holding up the crumpled receipt as if it were a warrant. I found this. Your poem at the Dune Mart. Opal's eyes narrowed. She looked from his earnest, tear-streaked face to the slip of paper in his hand. Her expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened into a mask of weary annoyance. It's a piece of paper on a public board. It's not an invitation. No, I know, but it's incredible, Ezra pressed on, his passion overriding his awkwardness. It's one of the most powerful things I've ever read. You should publish these. You have to. People need to read your work. I could help you. We could put together a book. The words tumbled out of him in a rush, a torrent of youthful, naive conviction. A dry, mirthless chuckle escaped Opal's lips. A book, she scoffed, the sound like rustling leaves. Kid, that dream died about 40 years and 100 bad decisions ago. Those are just ramblings, therapy for a dying old woman. Now if you'll excuse me. She began to push the door closed. The world was shrinking back to the familiar, safe confines of her trailer. Wait, Ezra said, a note of desperation in his voice. He didn't argue, didn't plead. Instead, he took a small step back, straightened his shoulders, and cleared his throat. He looked down at the receipt in his hand, and with all the reverence he felt, he began to read. Cicada Song for August Asterisk, he began, his voice soft but clear, carrying in the dry desert air. He read slowly, letting each word hang in the space between them. He wasn't performing, he was testifying. He poured his own grief, his own sense of being lost, and his profound admiration into the recitation. He gave her words the weight and respect he knew they deserved. Opal's hand, resting on the edge of the door, froze. She had written those words, yes, but she had never truly heard them. Not like this. Through the voice of this strange, emotional young man, her private pain was being transformed into something else, art. She heard her own stubborn defiance, her quiet courage, her deep and abiding loneliness, all reflected back at her, not as weakness but as strength. A single, hot tear escaped her eye, tracing a path through the deep lines on her cheek. It was the first tear she had shed for her own words in decades. The sound of the latch clicking open was barely audible, but for Ezra it was the loudest sound in the world. The door swung inward and she nodded, a silent, profound surrender. That quiet nod marked the beginning of an unlikely alliance. Ezra postponed his trip to California indefinitely, telling his cousin he'd found a summer project he couldn't abandon. He took a part-time job at the Dune Mart, the very place their story began, stocking shelves and mopping floors to pay for gas and cheap microwave meals. His life found a new, unexpected purpose. Every afternoon after his shift, he would go to Opal's trailer. Her home was a time capsule of a life lived and then halted. And in a large, dusty hatbox, he found the treasure. Hundreds of poems, scribbled on the backs of envelopes, on prescription pads, on the torn-off flaps of cardboard boxes. It was a lifetime of observations, a chronicle of love, loss, and quiet survival. He bought a ribbon for Opal's old manual typewriter, and with the patience of a monk, he began to transcribe them. The trailer was filled with the rhythmic asterisk clack-clack-clack of the keys, a sound of creation that had been silent for far too long. Ezra, a child of the digital age, knew that traditional publishers would likely dismiss an unsolicited manuscript from an unknown, elderly poet. So he turned to the world he knew. He created a crowdfunding page, calling it Publish Opal's Moonlight. He wrote their story simply and honestly, about a forgotten poet in a desert trailer park, about the universe contained on a cash register receipt, about a young man who got lost and found a reason to stay. He scanned the original, handwritten scraps of paper to show the raw authenticity of her work. For the title of the proposed collection, he chose a phrase from one of her poems, Moonlight in a Trailer Asterisk. At first, The response was a trickle, a $10 donation from a fellow literature student, a $25 pledge from a stranger who loved poetry. But Ezra was persistent. He shared the link in online poetry forums, in groups dedicated to uplifting stories, in communities for lovers of the American Southwest. Slowly, the story began to resonate. People were moved by the image of the frail woman and the earnest young man, a connection forged across generations by the power of a single poem. The trickle became a stream, then a river. Donations and messages of encouragement poured in from all over the country, and soon, the world. They had not only met their modest printing goal but had surpassed it tenfold. The success of the crowdfunder attracted the attention of a small, prestigious independent press in Oregon that specialized in poetry. They saw the story, but more importantly, they saw the startling, undeniable quality of the work itself. They offered to publish *Moonlight in a trailer professionally. The book, when it was released, was a quiet masterpiece. Its cover was a simple, stark photograph Ezra had taken of the marigold blooming in its pot against the corrugated metal of the trailer. It found its audience not through a massive marketing campaign, but through word of mouth, becoming a surprise bestseller in independent bookstores and poetry circles. Critics lauded its unflinching honesty and luminous grace. The crowning achievement was an invitation for Opal to be a featured reader at the prestigious National Online Poetry Festival. By then, her health had declined sharply. The disease was in its final, relentless stage, and most days she barely had the strength to leave her bed. But on the night of the festival, a fierce, final surge of energy seemed to animate her. She insisted on getting dressed. With Ezra's gentle help, she put on a simple, dark blue dress she hadn't worn in 30 years, a string of her mother's pearls around her neck. She even allowed Ezra to apply a touch of lipstick. In the small, cramped trailer, Ezra set up his laptop on a stack of books in front of her favorite armchair. He logged into the video call, and suddenly, Opal's weary, beautiful face was being broadcast to thousands of screens. The festival host introduced her with a voice full of reverence. Then the screen was hers. A profound silence fell over the digital space. Opal looked directly into the small camera lens, her pale blue eyes clear and calm. She took a slow, shallow breath, and with a voice that was frail but carried an unshakable authority, she read her last poem. It was a poem of gratitude, not of sorrow. It spoke of the world as a temporary gift, of love as a borrowed warmth, and of her own life preparing to dissolve back into the starlight from which it came. It was a lullaby, a blessing, and a final, elegant farewell. Opal passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 months later. She died not in obscurity but as the celebrated author of a beloved book, her voice having reached thousands. Ezra was with her in her final weeks, no longer just a friend, but the son she never had. He held her hand, read to her from her own book, and assured her that her light would not go out. He kept his promise. With the royalties from Moonlight in a trailer and the substantial remaining funds from the crowdfunder, Ezra established the Moonlight Foundation, a small grant program dedicated to supporting elderly artists and writers who, like Opal, were living in isolation or poverty. It was his way of ensuring her legacy wasn't just a book, but a continuing act of grace. The following fall, Ezra re-enrolled in college, this time switching his major to publishing studies. He now understood that books were not just artifacts, but lifelines. On quiet evenings in his dorm room, surrounded by the academic life he had fought so hard to reclaim, he would often pull his well-worn copy of *Moonlight in a trailer from the shelf. He would read Cicada Song for August and remember the overwhelming feeling of being seen by a stranger. He knew that the world would see the story as a young man saving a forgotten poet. But he knew the deeper truth, that a dying poet's words, written on the back of a receipt in the middle of the desert, had saved a lost boy and shown him the way home. One small light had illuminated another, and its glow would now and forever be passed on.